we're set. We're a little bit over time, but that's all right. This is week 7 of the Essential Lewis. So thank you for sticking it out with me for these past 7 weeks. I've really enjoyed it. It's been great just going back to some of these books that really I hadn't read since high school, early college, just really mining them for more of what they have to offer. So a quick word of prayer to start. Dear Lord, we thank you for this morning. We thank you once more for this opportunity to come before you in the company of the saints, to worship you, to meditate on you, and to be refreshed for the rest of the week, to go out and continue to serve you and to learn more about you. So we pray for your blessings on this next 45 minutes. We ask all this in your name. All right. As I said, it's been 7 weeks, and we've covered quite a bit of ground. We had an introduction to Lewis as a writer. We went through the 4 books of Mere Christianity. We went through almost all of Screwtape Letters over the past 2 weeks. So today we'll cover the very final chapter and conclude. Screwtape Letters, written in 1941. I just love this picture. We talked a little bit already about spiritual sight and spiritual blindness. The idea that the devil and the demons have this particular vantage point where they're spirits, so they're able to see certain things in the spiritual world more clear than we can, but they're evil, so they're unable to see certain things that, thanks to the grace of God, we now can see. So some of the things that they might have a clearer sight on is the church, God himself, their own nature, and the war. By this I mean World War II, human affairs. Some things that they might struggle to see, though, are things like joy, virtue, even the pleasures themselves, and love. So we had said last week that the demons have sort of they use the terms of love. They, Wormwood and Screwtape, they sign their letters affectionately Screwtape, or Dear Wormwood. So there are these hallmarks of love and affection, but the love of hell is really predatory. It's really, what can I get out of you? How can I consume you for my own well-being? And so they're not able to understand God's love, which is sacrificial, which looks out for the good of the beloved in a disinterested way. And they don't understand that. I also talked about the A plot and the B plot in the Screwtape Letters. So the A plot is everything that happens to the humans, on the human plane. We have the target becoming a Christian, World War II happens, he starts to mature, he falls in love, and at the very end, he dies. Then there's the B plot, which is what's going on, I suppose, down below. This is sort of the dynamic between Screwtape and Wormwood. Screwtape starts out the book advising Wormwood, but at some point, Screwtape commits this heresy, where he says, God really loves, and from the vantage point of Satan, for whatever reason, it's heretical, it's a punishable offense to say that God is motivated by love. It has to be something else. It has to be something equally predatory. And so Screwtape makes these mistakes by speaking heretically in his letters. Wormwood decides to try to take advantage of that by reporting on Screwtape to the secret police, saying, you should check this guy out, he's a heretic. But Screwtape is more powerful, right? He has these connections, and he sort of smooths things over and confronts Wormwood and sort of mocks him, saying, I know you tried to do me in, it didn't work because I'm better than you. And then at the end, when the target dies a Christian, Wormwood fails. And so we get to see these last few things happen in this last chapter. So this is chapter 31. I wanted to give you some tasting notes before we read chapter 31. You know, if you go to a coffee bar, they say, look out for hazelnut and vanilla. That's the kind of thing I want to do before we get into chapter 31. This relationship between Screwtape and Wormwood really comes to its fruition here. So in the previous chapter, in chapter 30, Screwtape is kind of fed up with Wormwood's continued incompetence to temptation. So at one point he says, bring us back food, or be food yourself. And this is the prophecy that is fulfilled in chapter 31. We also talked about spiritual sight, but at the point of the patient's death, there are some things that he will be able to see. And so this topic comes back up again. And then we have what's called the backward look. And we'll get into that a little bit more afterwards. So I'm going to read quite a bit of a longer section, but as I said, each chapter is just a couple of pages anyway, so stay with me. And you really have to read this in your best kind of simpering, scheming, victorious, devilish voice. So do your best. I'm going to do my best. My dear, my very dear Wormwood, my poppet, my pigsney. I call my wife a pigsney every morning. I know. How mistakenly, now that all is lost, you come whimpering to ask me whether the terms of affection in which I address you meant nothing from the beginning. Far from it. Rest assured, my love for you and your love for me are as like as two peas. I have always desired you, as you, pitiful fool, desired me. The difference is that I am the stronger. I think they will give you to me now, or a bit of you. Love you? Why, yes, as dainty a morsel as ever I grew fat on. You have let a soul slip through your fingers. The howl of sharpened famine for that loss re-echoes at this moment through all the levels of the kingdom of noise down to the very throne itself. It makes me mad to think of it. How well I know what happened at the instant that they snatched him from you. There was a sudden clearing of his eyes, was there not, as he saw you for the first time, and recognized the part you had had in him, and knew that you had it no longer. Just think, and let it be the beginning of your agony, what he felt at that moment, as if a scab had fallen from an old sword, as if you were emerging from a hideous, shell-like tether, as if he shuffled off for good and all a defiled, wet, clinging garment. By hell, it is misery enough to see them in their mortal days taking off dirtied and uncomfortable clothes and splashing in hot water and giving little grunts of pleasure, stretching their eased limbs. What then of this final stripping, this complete cleansing? The more one thinks about it, the worse it becomes. He got through so easily. No gradual misgivings, no doctor's sentence, no nursing home, no operating theater, no false hopes of life. Sheer, instantaneous liberation. One moment it seemed to be all our world. The scream of bombs, the fall of houses, the stink and taste of high explosive on the lips and in the lungs, the feet burning with weariness, the heart cold with horrors, the brain reeling, the legs aching. Next moment, all this was gone. Gone like a bad dream, never again to be of any account. Defeated, outmaneuvered fool. Did he more account naturally, as if he'd been born for it? The earth-born vermin entered the new life? How all his doubts became, in the twinkling of an eye, ridiculous. I know what the creature was saying to itself. Yes, of course, it was always like this. All horrors have followed the same course, getting worse and worse and forcing you into a kind of bottleneck, till at the very moment when you thought you must be crushed, behold, you were out of the narrows, and all was suddenly well. The extraction hurt more and more, and then the tooth was out. The dream became a nightmare, and then you woke. You die, and then you are beyond death. How could I ever have doubted it? As he saw you, he also saw them. I know how it was. You reeled back dizzy and blinded, more hurt by them than he had ever been by bombs. The degradation of it, that this thing of earth and slime could stand upright and converse with spirits before whom you, a spirit, could only cower. Perhaps you had hoped that the awe and strangeness of it would dash his joy. But that is the cursed thing. The gods are strange to mortal eyes, and yet they are not strange. He had no faintest conception till that very hour of how they would look, and even doubted their existence. But when he saw them, he knew that he had always known them, and realized what part each one of them had played at many an hour in his life when he had supposed himself alone, so that now he could say to them one by one, not, "Who are you?" but, "So it was you all the time." All that they were and said at this meeting woke memories. The dim consciousness of friends about him, which had haunted his solitudes from infancy, was now at last explained. That central music in every pure experience, which had always just evaded memory, was now at last recovered. Recognition made him free of their company almost before the limbs of his corpse became quiet. Only you were left outside. He saw not only them, he saw him. This animal, this thing begotten in a bed, could look on him. What is blinding, suffocating fire to you is now cool light to him, is clarity itself, and wears the form of a man. You would like, if you could, to interpret the patient's prostration in the presence, his self-abhorrence and utter knowledge of his sins. Yes, Wormwood, a clearer knowledge even than yours, on the analogy of your own choking and paralyzing sensations when you encounter the deadly air that breathes from the heart of heaven. But it's all nonsense. Pains he may still have to encounter, but they embrace those pains. They would not barter them for any earthly pleasure. All the delights of sense or heart or intellect with which you could once have tempted him, even the delights of virtue itself, now seem to him in comparison but as the half-nauseous attractions of a rattled harlot would seem to a man who hears that his true beloved, whom he has loved all his life and whom he believed to be dead, is alive, and even now, at his door. He is caught up into that world, where pain and pleasure take on trans-finite values, and all our arithmetic is dismayed. Once more, the inexplicable meets us. Next to the curse of useless tempters like yourself, the greatest curse upon us is the failure of our intelligence department. If only we could find out what he was really up to. Alas, alas, that knowledge, in itself so hateful and mawkish a thing, should yet be necessary for power. Sometimes I am almost in despair. All that sustains me is the conviction that our realism, our rejection in the face of all temptations, of all silly nonsense and claptrap, must win in the end. Meanwhile, I have you to settle with. Most truly do I sign myself your increasingly and ravenously affectionate uncle, Screwtape. In a way, Screwtape wins. He triumphs over Wormwood, but also in a very serious and collective way, hell loses, because this believer has died and has entered into the company of God. Back to our tasting notes. This is that culmination, right? Screwtape actually feels the loss of this soul in a certain way, right? He says that hell is full of this famine, this hunger, that they have nothing to feed on. And so even though it's Wormwood's fault, even though Wormwood is going to be punished somehow, all of hell feels this loss. And yet Screwtape is doing his best to try to make himself out as coming out victorious. So he thinks, if I can kind of exert my power on my poor nephew, at least I get something out of the deal. And that really is the logic of hell, right? A final loss, and so there's this cling to temporary wins, smaller wins, that ultimately are kind of meaningless. Whether Screwtape eats Wormwood or Wormwood eats Screwtape, they're both in hell, and that's where they'll stay. But this is what they're focused on. And this is how the entire relationship that Screwtape and Wormwood have been building over this whole book, that's how it ends. And it's interesting how it starts, right? We don't get Screwtape's received letters. We only know the letters that Screwtape is sending. So we don't know what kind of letters Wormwood is sending. But it sounds like Wormwood, the same guy who tried to sell his own uncle to the secret police, started off this letter by saying, "Uncle, I'm sorry I lost, but if you have any shred of affection, forgive me." And Screwtape is having none of that. So that's their relationship, and this is the only way it could have ended up, right? This is the only conclusion. We talked about spiritual sight. Now this is the spiritual sight of the target, right? Wormwood has it such that when the target dies, he sees him for the first time, and he's given this insight. This is a spiritual insight. He's able to look back through his life and separate out Wormwood's influence from that of his own. And I think what's even more amazing is that he is rewarded with this sight of angels, of God's encouragement and guardians, and eventually God himself. And again, he's given this penetrating kind of sight that he can think back on his life and sort of point out, oh, this was when the angels were protecting me. This is when God was protecting me. It's kind of like that classic Footprints poem, right? be able to look back and say, oh, the footprints look the same, but now I can identify whose are whose. Something about the way that they're created, they're sort of anonymous. And I think Lewis really likes this idea of spiritual sight. And now we get to what I call the backward look. The backward look is this, I think, recurring motif in Lewis's fiction and his nonfiction. It's not even his invention, but any testimony that you and I have heard is from this vantage point. That before I came to a saving faith, I was just walking through my life, doing my own thing. I didn't think of myself as leading up towards this encounter with Christ. But when I became a Christian, I was able to look back on my life, and instead of thinking about my own path, the path that I was forging for myself, I can see the ways in which God was pursuing me, guiding me to himself. This is an example of what I'm calling the backward look. I think that we get this kind of insight at the moment of salvation. I think Lewis here is describing a kind of right in the middle of the end of our earthly life, right before the beginning of our heavenly life. He's also looking back at his earthly life. He's getting this insight. There are all these times I thought I was alone when really God himself was with me. And I think that we will continue to see this in other books, that this is the kind of insight that heaven also gives us on our time on earth. So I want to pull in a quote from The Great Divorce. This is actually a quote from the preface of The Great Divorce, but I think it's a topic in that book which can sometimes be misunderstood. So I want to spend a little bit of time on it. This is Lewis talking about the introduction to The Great Divorce. So this is just him talking. Earth, I think, will not be found by anyone to be in the end a very distinct place. I think Earth, if chosen instead of heaven, will turn out to have been, all along, only a region in hell. And Earth, if put second to heaven, to have been from the beginning a part of heaven itself. We don't want to misunderstand it. He's not speaking geographically. He's not even really speaking doctrinally or metaphysically. This is a way of looking at things, but I want to sort of open this up. What do we think he means?
Possibly where someone starts before they go to where they will go. So we all start on earth, but those that choose Christ end up in heaven, and so therefore this is part of the path that they take. And then those that reject Christ, they obviously end up in hell, and so that's the path that they take.
Yeah. There's a way in the path that leads to a certain place is identified by the place that it leads to, the homeward path, right? So I think there's an element of that here. What else? Yeah.
I mean, because what I see from that is, so first of all, earth is already separated from God. So you have that region of hell, I guess. So if you choose the things of the earth instead of the things of the Lord, then one, you're already separated from God. You're going to stay separated from God. In fact, that's what it is. You are separated, and you're going to stay separated.
Yeah.
However, if you choose God first, then you're going to receive his blessings that will feel like the beginning of heaven.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about the gospel, we often say, when you become saved, when you become a Christian, you have been given eternal life. We don't say, when you die, you will get eternal life. We say that eternal life is actually a relationship with God. So it starts the moment that you're saved in this strange way. While we're still on earth, still somewhat separated. I saw a hand. Yes?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but he's an idealist, right? He believes basically heaven is our eternal home, not a new heaven, new earth.
I don't think so, but I think in a manner of speaking, that is what he's saying. The reason that I picked this up is because I might have said this in the first class, but when I first read The Great Divorce, I thought I was getting like a map to how the afterlife was. And that's very much not what this book is. And I have plucked this quote out of context, so it's the most confusing possible. But no, I think Lewis would not call himself an idealist, certainly. But I think it's a certain way of speaking. It's a certain restricted way of speaking in which this is true. So that's what I want us to get to. what is the certain specific restricted way in which what he's saying is true? I saw a hand here and then also. Yeah?
I think the present colors the past, especially how we view the past.
Sure.
We always heard like the victors write the history.
Sure.
And so we know as Christians that all of our struggles and temptations and testing is for our good. But that's only in light of who God is and how he's doing that. So if somebody never knows God and ends up in eternity apart from him, then they'll never know. Like their testings and their struggles will only ever have been for bad. Because they won't know how or what it was leading them to.
Right. I saw a hand here as well, yeah.
Yeah, I think it has to do with like, where does it say in the Bible that they turn them over to their own sins?
Yeah.
So people who choose to be obsessed more with their sins, focus more on their sins, pursuing their sins, are experiencing hell from now, essentially. Where when you choose God, we are sanctified, and part of our sanctification is hopefully turning us closer and closer to be like Jesus. At what point we can begin experiencing heaven on earth through the Lord's blessing and becoming more and more like him in that journey. But
Exactly. I think we're getting at it here. I think this all partly has to do with there's this strange sort of phenomenon in the Bible about temptations and testing. Very often it's kind of the same word, and it seems to depend on context whether we should translate it temptation and testing. And I think generally the way I've heard this explained to me is that it's about the intention. It can kind of look the same. It can be a difficult experience. But the devil tempts you because his intention is for you to fail, whereas God tests you and then his intention is for you to succeed, to grow in your faith. So God never tempts us because he never wants us to fail. And I guess the Screwtape Letters would say that the devil never tests you because he doesn't know how to make people virtuous. So I think that this is related. In some ways, if you fail a temptation, it can just be a temptation that you fail. But if you pass a test, it can be a test that you pass. It's sort of strange, but it partly does have to do with the end goal, with where you end up. And I think we would say it more, your state, right? Are you saved? Do you have a relationship with God? Has that eternal life that God promises, are you living that? Do you have that eternal life, that relationship with God? That changes everything, right? So I think that that's what Lewis is saying here, that when we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. Sorry, I had to mention that. But the reason part of it will be a day of rejoicing is, and this is hinted in chapter 31, that there might be pain, right? There's this judgment in which we have to give an account to God of all of our actions. For me, a lot of that is probably not going to be very enjoyable for me, but that's what we have to do. God is going to ask this of us, and yet that experience is going to be for our good. When we get up there, it's not God trying to heap blame and guilt, sorrow and shame on us. It's really about drawing things into account, enacting perfect justice, so that we can enter into a deeper relationship with him. So I think that when we see something like this, especially in the Great Divorce, I think Lewis says in his preface, this is all sort of a figure of speech. This isn't a literal interpretation or a kind of fantastical speculation of what heaven might be like. It's more similar to a parable in which there's a certain way in which the parable is true, especially for some of them, and not every aspect of it is meant to be taken literally. But I think that this backward look phenomenon I find to be very powerful. If you think about the inverse of it, you think about when we get to heaven, we'll have this insight on what all of the sufferings on earth will have been for. We don't have that now. And Lewis actually says in this preface, it's a mistake to try to assume the heavenly perspective on earth. We just don't have that yet. We still don't know exactly who is fighting over us. We don't exactly know when the angels are there supporting us, when the demon is there tempting us. All we kind of know is what God has told us, what he gives us the insight to see. But the hope that we have is that when we get to heaven, all will be explained. Everything will make sense. And so I think what Lewis would want us to do is not to try to assume that heavenly perspective, but believe that it is there. Believe that from God's perspective, from the perspective of heaven, of being united to Him, it does all make sense. So now we have a faith, and afterwards we'll have a sight. And I think that's why this backward look is so powerful for Lewis, and that's why it keeps coming up in other of his works. I'm reading The Pilgrim's Regress right now, and that is something that takes a while for the main character to get saved. So the backward look that he gets is at the point of salvation, back towards his journey before salvation. This backward look is after someone dies, about their earthly life, and it's a very common, actually it's like a medieval motif, much before Lewis, thousands of years, just the idea that when you die, you get to look at earth. You get to look at what you were fighting for. You get to look at, how important everything seemed and how unimportant it seems from a heavenly perspective. So this is what I'm calling the backward look, and I think that it keeps coming up in Lewis's scholarship. I don't want to leave a potentially fraught doctrinal question like this unresolved. So do we feel good about where we are? Yeah.
I just wanted to offer my thoughts on how I think Lewis talks a lot about heaven and hell is not as the destination, but more of a nature or the eternal kind of life. I think most clearly it's in the Great Divorce, but also in Pure Christianity, he talks a lot about how every decision we make turns us toward heavenly creatures or hellish creatures.
Right.
Not that we'll actually be in heaven if we make enough right decisions, but that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think for me it just comes back to that John 17:3, right? This is eternal life, that they may know God. So if we have been saved, we believe that we've already started getting to know God. Earth is at a distance, so our ability to get close to Him is vastly heightened. All the barriers are removed in heaven, but we've already started. We already know God. We already have this relationship with Him. So that eternal life has already begun. Like I did want to.
I was just gonna say that when I first read that about painful expectation, I wasn't sure if he's talking about not wanting to rule out a purgatory type experience.
Sure, yeah.
Or if he's talking about, you just explained a while ago, which leads me to another question about extinction. If he eats wormwood and and it's food,
Sure.
once you digest food, the being is gone. So
Yeah.
I'm talking about, that's
Sure.
hell is not really eternal, but it's more.
It's possible. There's another quote that I had in here, but I got rid of it. When Screwtape first finds out about Wormwood's plot, he says, by the way, I've enclosed a brochure for you of all of the penitentiary services for incompetent tempters. Great illustrations. You're going to love it. You're not going to sleep a wink. So I think this is sort of that parable aspect, that it talks about consumption. Demonic consumption is honestly very similar to what we would see in the New Testament as possession. That it's this sort of overtaking of my will onto yours such that your will is emptied out. So I do get the sense that there's some wiggle room, but I would say it's unclear. I don't think that Lewis believes that wormwood ceases to exist. At least I don't see that to be the case, but it's a fair point to bring up. Any other questions on this slide? Okay, good. So this is the end of the Screwtape Letters, and I do want to congratulate you all, because it's two pretty dense books that we covered in a short amount of time. The reason that I picked these two was I wanted to show you Lewis's range. The class is called The Essential C.S. Lewis. So I was trying to get at the root of this man, his writing, his approach to both fiction and nonfiction, but really how that all comes from his relationship with God, his studies in the Bible and in Christian literature. So I haven't showed this graph up on the screen for a little while, but if you remember, we started with this idea of Lewis's fiction on this side and his nonfiction on the other. The dotted lines are the books that we actually covered, and I kind of bolded the books that came up in conversation. I changed the order of this graph a little bit. Before, I had Abolition of Man as kind of a key to all the other, and The Great Divorce is kind of a key to all the other. But I realized Abolition of Man, it's a little difficult. The Four Loves, I think, is also a little bit difficult, but if you wanted to read something after Mere Christianity, I think The Four Loves would be great. It's really worth it. It is sort of a step up in difficulty, but I think less so than Abolition of Man. And yeah, I think both The Great Divorce and Narnia are probably not too challenging, but different audiences, you know. We also talked about some other books that came up. So I mentioned The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton is a Catholic, but this is a work of apologetics. So it's talking about Christ as the linchpin of history, how before Christ everything was leading up to him, after Christ everything has been completely changed and kind of defined by him. So that's a work that Lewis really loved. And that was sort of on the nonfiction side. On the fiction side, I talked about a few of these older books: The Divine Comedy by Dante, Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, Paradise Lost by John Milton, that kind of go into Lewis's imaginative framework and some of his ideas of how temptation works, what maturity looks like, certainly what devils are like. But yeah, the reason that I put this up here is one of my goals for this class was to acquaint you all with Lewis as a writer. So I think that probably these two main books get a lot of the airtime, but if you kind of get a sense of, okay, I know the sort of things that he writes about, I know kind of what he sounds like, that was part of the goal of this class. The other part was to sort of think about this question, and I asked you this question in the first week, and I know some of you maybe have been following along or have gotten to read Lewis a little bit over the past few weeks. So I kind of want to open this up again to you. Same question, but we're 7 weeks wiser. So why would you say, if you had to say, why would you read Lewis? Or maybe if you haven't read him and you haven't gotten a chance, if you're interested to read him, or if you changed your mind, or somehow I've convinced you never to look at him, also please, I'd love to hear from you.
I think that a lot of people have a lot of the same questions he addresses. They may not be in our circles, but it gives you, it kind of equips you to go ahead and give the answer, as they call it.
Sure. What kind of questions are you thinking of? I think I know what you mean.
They're asking, theological questions, not even realizing they're theological.
Sure.
They're asking about, heaven and hell, of course, but they're asking about, how should we then live?
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Right. What else? Any other thoughts on Lewis as a result? Yeah, please.
Well, I think it, particularly the fiction ones, it shows what's really going on, and it's a way we can relate to understanding what the devils might be thinking and doing, and also that's how it works, or something.
Yeah.
And so, it's a more relatable way to think about it than reading just the Bible for someone who's not turned on by just the Bible. And,
Sure.
And so it's just a different angle of, there's definitely something going on besides what we see.
Definitely. Yeah, there's 2 points there, right? One, I think the Bible doesn't want us to be ignorant of this spiritual battle. And I think if you guys were in second service last Sunday, John wanted to talk about this point about demonic activity, and his mic kept cutting out. So clearly someone doesn't want you to know about this, but definitely the Bible wants you to know about this aspect of life. But the second thing that you mentioned was what I had called restoration, this idea that really in all of Christian literature, anything extra biblical, there's nothing fully new. There's nothing completely original, right? Everything that Lewis is talking about, and any good Christian writer, it's going to be grounded in biblical truth. So why bother? And Lewis talks about this in one of his essays on why he chose to write Narnia as a fairy tale. Just this idea that in our own minds, if something's familiar, it can become stale. Not through any fault of that thing, but just as a fault of our own flesh, our own mind. So having these same kinds of truths, as Ephesians 6 introduced to us in a different way, can just kind of spark that interest. And ultimately, we do want to go back to the Bible and maybe read Ephesians 6 with a new pair of eyes and kind of imagine, this is really happening. This is really what's going on.
Well, so like one of the major contradictions is there's such a hierarchy and rules, all these rules and so forth for hell.
Sure.
And so that's like a standard of truth.
Right.
Yeah, they deny truth.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it was funny to me that it sounds like Wormwood actually was appealing to a sense of love. But that's the entire philosophy of hell, is that there's no love. So yeah, there's this kind of contradiction, I think, just in its existence at all.
And that's what Francis Schaeffer brings out in some of his writings, is there's a lot of people out there they have their own reality, and they have their rules they're setting up, but they don't really conform to reality.
Sure. Yeah, no framework makes sense all the way down to the ground, right? Except for the Christian framework. I kind of want to move on to this larger question of the class, because obviously I like Lewis, and he's been such an impact. He's been such a guide, and I think an example for me in my own life. But I think this brings up a larger question. Why should we read at all? And one thing that Lewis says in another essay is, if you don't read good books, you're going to read bad ones. Now, some of you might have a counter argument. Well, I have never read a book in my life, so take that. But actually, I think what he's getting at here is that there are other things we do in life aside from just study the Bible and go to church and go to our jobs. There's something that you might call entertainment, you might call a hobby, you might just call self-improvement or self-help. But all of these things are mediated to us in some way. It might not be books anymore because we have YouTube and every kind of other media. But I think Lewis's point here is that we're going to engage with something, and some of those things are good, some of those things are bad, and they don't all have to be exactly the same. But there is this urgency that he has towards developing a taste, developing a kind of sense of, is this activity good for me? Is it drawing me closer to the Lord? And again, if you see in the Screwtape Letters, the demons hate kind of simple things. In this last chapter, the idea that we take baths and clean ourselves and take off dirty clothes, that's offensive to the devils. They don't want us to have any kind of simple pleasures. But the opposite is true of God, right? He made these things. He wants us to enjoy them and to have rest and to have fun with each other. But when it comes to reading, and kind of reading as a stand-in for any kind of media, any sort of thing that you're paying attention to that's communicating to you in some way, why should we do this at all? Yeah.
Lewis talks about chronological snobbery.
Sure.
That our best ideas, or our ideas now, are the best ideas that we're thinking of.
Yeah.
Chesterton talks about this in Orthodoxy. He's talking about tradition, but I think this applies to just anybody who wrote good books a long time ago. Of the democracy of the dead, of allowing their voices to be heard because they were alive and they had real experiences with God, and instead of just getting rid of them and not even interfacing with them, but actually taking them into account.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's like the best kind of. You think of Amazon reviews, Now I think they're all like 99% Chinese bots, right? But like 10 to 15 years ago, there was a sweet spot where an Amazon review, there were enough people on there, you could really trust them. The classics, the classical traditions, the books that have remained popular, and other works of media that have remained popular throughout all of human history, they're a similar kind of trustworthy Amazon review system. So if you don't want to waste your time, and you pick up a book that you probably just heard the title of, you're probably going to be okay. That's definitely part of it. I think I saw it, yeah.
I read somewhere that if you just spend 15 minutes reading, that it's like one of the most refreshing activities that you can do. Versus I think I just generally go to my phone, or I'm gonna watch a video, or I'm just gonna do something else. Or maybe you feel like it's a waste of time to rest because you have so many things that you need to do. But I've been really finding it, especially in the season as we're waiting for the baby and we can actually rest, is just taking 15 minutes to read has been really wonderful. Because I think sometimes I look at a book, I'm not on it with a hunger for books. I think I tend to have to make myself read. And so if I set a timer for 15 minutes, I'm just gonna sit and read this book, I tend to read a lot longer, and I really find that my body feels much more refreshed and better in my mind and whatnot. And so, and especially when when you read something like Lewis, it's fun to read, the Space Trilogy or Narnia or whatnot. But then when you also get to have fun, but also feel oh, maybe I should read more about heaven, or I should know more about what he's talking about, then that is the most inspiring sort of media that you could look at instead of watching people's opinions on YouTube. You'd rather God's opinion than random people. So because it's refreshing, I would say.
And I will disclaim, I have to push myself to read books too. But a great motivation is you're gonna have to teach a class on it on Sunday. So that's been very helpful.
So I've heard a quote, I've heard somebody say something similar to C.S. Lewis here: if you don't read good books, you'll read bad ones. If you don't fill your mind with good stuff, you're going to fill it with bad stuff, right? And so when I think about C.S. Lewis, I think about how he's really talented in a few ways that we get to see. Number one, he's a very efficient communicator, and he's a great storyteller, okay? So I enjoy reading. Please don't feel bad. Please don't think bad of me, but like John Grisham. He's a great storyteller, but it's junk food for the mind, right? I mean, it's really not good, right? Hemingway is probably a step up, but still, it's very difficult to find, you know, the good that he's pulling out. The Old Man and the Sea is, I think, a great story to dissect and look at, but you have to try really, really hard. And what C.S. Lewis does that I think is remarkable is he says, no, this is very intentional. So don't, you don't have to look, too hard to see what we're really talking about here, whether it's Chronicles of Narnia, Screwtape Letters. And so I think that finding somebody like C.S. Lewis that is very intentional, where you're gonna hopefully grow as a person, because he is such a great storyteller, but he's so efficient at communicating the stuff that you really are trying to pull out.
Yeah, he is kind of that sweet spot between kind of makes you a better reader, a better thinker, but he's not so difficult that it feels like you have too much homework. Just read him. And I think that's part of why I actually like him, as much as I like him for his own works, just kind of as someone who introduced me to other works that were equally good, and even kind of giving a little bit of guidance, sort of teaching a little bit, and that's kind of his day job. So I think that if you can find someone like that who does that for you, who sort of is, literature, but also opens you up to this whole world of literature, kind of holds your hand a little bit, that's great. I think that's why I like Lewis, but I know there are other figures that people have found.
So something that I learned a long time ago that has stuck with me is what I would call the 3 Ps, right? It's the idea is that perspective is predicated by presupposition. And so the reason that you read is because whenever you go into something, your perspective is colored by those presuppositions that you don't even realize that you have, right? And so without being able to read and understand why you have the perspectives that you have, why they color the experiences that you endure, and then the way that you react to things, you don't fully appreciate the way that God has made you, right? And so for someone who doesn't know who the Lord is, right, who is just going along life, their perspective is completely colored in a different way, but it's still following presupposition, right? So that, your perspective is always going to be predicated by your presuppositions, and so it is paramount that you read. I didn't mean to plug a whole bunch of P's as I was saying. That's always stuck with me. Reading is just so important.
Absolutely, and that actually gets to my next point. I want to brainstorm a little bit about how to read. I'm guessing you all know the basics of how to read, so don't think that I'm insulting you. But I know that reading is difficult. I also know that it takes time, and they tell me all these great things about becoming a new dad. No one has yet told me about all the free time I'm gonna have, so I'm waiting for that. But for those of you, with maybe more experience in the room, I'd like us to sort of brainstorm about just tips for how to start reading, how to find time, how to get the most out of it. So another quote that I'll steal from Lewis is an essay called On the Reading of Old Books. And this really gets at something that I think Roy and Crew were also saying. It is a good rule, after reading a new book, never to allow yourself another new one until you've read an old one in between. If that is too much for you, you should at least read one old one to every 3 new ones. The reason that he says that is that the old books are predicated on different presumptions. And so if we kind of read something that fully makes sense to us, it's possible that it hasn't really challenged us that much. If we read something that's it's not about how learned it is, but it's just strange. The author is taking things for granted that you would never take for granted. These are the kinds of experiences that expand your conception of how people lived, maybe in different times, in different places. And I found that doing that with Christians is especially great. Reading stuff from Christians that lived 100 years ago, 500 years ago, it's just interesting to see, okay, the gospel is the same, the Bible, the reverence is the same, but certain things are different, and I can learn from those things. But I do just kind of want to open this up. And I think I really want to learn, how do you read? How do you keep finding time to read? What are strategies that we found that make reading worthwhile. I know that one frustration people have sometimes is feeling that I read this book 5 years ago, I don't remember a single thing about it. So I think there's this question of how do we find time to read, and how do we make reading feel worthwhile to ourselves, and maybe, when it comes to having a family and increased responsibilities. I just want to open that up. How do we do this? If we all agree that it's great.
I used to have a job I could read a book a day,
Yeah?
and still fulfill all my duties, so that was really good. But you have to be real intentional, because I say, okay, I'm gonna have this time set aside, no distractions. Otherwise, you just try to squeeze it in, you're gonna be distracted.
Yeah.
To jettison social media. Not to say that, cause I read voraciously, I love to read, but I'm not on any, and I'm not saying I'm better, but I found that social media is a huge distraction from thinking, so I think it's been a real deterrent in recent times for finding the time to read. And I had 7 kids, I homeschooled, I didn't, I read what they read, but now that they're gone, I can read whatever I want to read.
Yeah.
So it's just my personal, and not to be judgy or anything, but I think that's a real deterrent.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's kind of the only way to free up space, right? Getting rid of other things. Okay, I saw this hand and this hand and this hand.
Yeah, so I was listening to a podcast the other day while I was getting ready, and she was talking about how she's always reading 3 books at a time, which I'm like, I don't know how you can do that. But 3 books at a time, and she only reads like 1 chapter. She'll read 1 chapter in this book, and then she'll read the next one. And if she wants to continue on with that one, then she does. And so I've kind of started that, and it had to be 3 very different kinds of books. And it works pretty well, but she's like, I read instead of watch TV. Like, I don't turn the TV on because it's nothing I'm really interested in anyway, and I just read instead. And I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna start doing that. And it has helped. It has helped.
Nice.
Well, I have like little ones, so one of the things, I also do read, kind of like what they have to read. So yeah, that's what I do, like at night. So right now, we're reading the Pilgrim's Progress, and it's going slowly, right, because we can only do it maybe like 3 times a week.
Sure.
At best. And so yeah, that's what we do. Now concerning, it is true about social media, it does kind of take away a lot of time. So what I do is I try to listen to, plugging this in right quick, while I'm walking the dog or while I'm getting ready for work, and just listen to something that is useful for biblically. So like right now I started reading everything about the Crusades.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, people should never feel ashamed about audiobooks. I know that you might expect someone like me to think that they're inferior, and they kind of are, but like, they're better than nothing. So never feel ashamed for audiobooks. We're gonna go here.
So I'm going to actually quote a friend of mine who passed away about 8 years ago, close friend of mine. He wasn't talking about reading, but he was probably talking about working out. But what he was saying though, what he told me though was very, could be applied here. He said, you have to find the value in it. Because what you value, you will make time for. So you have to find and ascribe the value to it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something descriptive about our schedules. They kind of already reveal what we think. I'll get to you.
So first of all, Jose, in baseball we say slow is smooth, smooth is fast. So take your time reading. It's okay. As long as you're reading, you're doing it. I'm a poor reader. My wife is an excellent reader. So what I've seen that helps her is she's able to be much more efficient at it when she's part of a reading group. Right, and
Definitely.
I've been very envious of that. Women seem to be better at that than guys.
They are.
And anyway, I don't feel comfortable asking people to go to those groups, but I can see where it's a huge benefit for her.
They don't appreciate it. If you
Yeah.
I really do think that the women are way better than the guys at organizing book clubs. So we need to step it up. You know, maybe there'll be something in the works afterwards.
Yeah.
I think Brian, did you have your hand up earlier? No? That's something. Okay, it's almost time. So I'm just gonna end with thanking you all again. Really great to have you, and you're really wonderful. I would love to get your feedback in any way. So if you come talk to me afterwards or even anything, just love to hear how you feel the class could have been improved or anything. at all. And I've been recording everything. It's been just facing me, so none of you are in it. Don't worry about it. But they're on YouTube, and I have that URL, and I'll leave that up in case anyone wants to go check them out. But other than that, thank you. It's been really wonderful being able to do this class with you all. So you all dismissed. Thanks again.